At 75, Joan Lunden can look back at a face that millions of Americans once knew, almost as well as the faces in their own kitchens. For 17 years, she entered their homes before work, before school, and before the day had fully begun. She sat beneath the bright studio lights of Good Morning America, welcomed viewers with an easy smile, and made difficult news feel less frightening. To many families, she was not simply a television journalist, she was part of the morning routine. That familiar image is still powerful. Joan appeared composed, energetic, and prepared for whatever the broadcast placed in front of her. She interviewed presidents, entertainers, medical experts, grieving families, and ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments. She traveled across the country and around the world, then returned to the same desk where viewers expected to find her again. The rhythm seemed dependable because Joan made it look dependable, but television only showed the portion of her life that fit inside the frame. In March 2026, Joan published her 11th book, Joan, Life Beyond the Script. At 75, she was finally putting words around experiences that had often been softened, hidden, or left outside the broadcast. She wrote about entering newsrooms when women were still treated as visitors, raising children while working one of television's most demanding schedules, losing people she loved, being pushed aside by an industry obsessed with youth, and facing an aggressive form of breast cancer. The woman telling that story was older than the Joan many viewers remembered, but she was no longer limited by the expectations that once followed her into the studio. She did not have to protect a network, preserve a morning show image, or make an uncomfortable truth sound pleasant before the commercial break. If Joan Lunden was part of your mornings, leave a like as we look beyond the smile America trusted for nearly 2 decades. Long before New York or network television, she was Joan Elise Blunden, a girl growing up in Fair Oaks, California. Her father, Dr. Earl Blunden, was a respected physician and cancer surgeon. He was also an enthusiastic pilot who owned a small plane and loved flying. To Joan, he represented confidence, education, and the belief that a person should remain curious about the world. Her childhood included the ordinary details that later become precious because nobody realizes they are temporary. There were family routines, school days, conversations with her father, and the reassuring assumption that the adults she depended on would still be there when she came home. Then, in January 1964, that assumption disappeared. Joan was 13 when her father was killed in a plane crash while returning from an American Cancer Society meeting. The physician who spent his career confronting disease died suddenly in the sky, leaving his family with no chance to prepare and no final conversation that could make the loss easy. Years later, people asked Joan why the tragedy had not made her afraid to fly. Her answer revealed something important about the way she carried grief. Her father had loved flying, she explained, and she believed it would have broken his heart if his death had taken that love away. She did not erase the fear by pretending the loss had not happened. She refused to let the loss decide every place she would go afterward. That response would become a pattern in Joan's life. When something painful changed the direction of her story, she kept moving, often before anyone around her understood what the movement cost. Viewers would later recognize the confidence, but they would rarely see the private discipline beneath it. At 13, Joan did not know that she would one day speak to millions of cancer. She did not know that she would become a patient herself, or that her father's work would return to her memory during the most frightening medical battle. She only knew that the chair he once occupied was empty and that childhood had ended earlier than expected. Before America trusted Joan Lunden to guide it through the morning, she had already learned how quickly an ordinary day could become the dividing line between before and after. In this chapter, I'm grounding the early career scenes in Joan Lunden's own recent memoir accounts. Her unexpected start at Sacramento's KCRA in 1973, the hostility she faced as a young woman in local news, and the difficult transition to WABC in New York. In 1973, Joan Lunden was not yet the woman America would invite into its living room every morning. She was 23, living in Sacramento, still trying to understand what kind of future could possibly fit the life she had imagined after losing her father so young. For a time, she had considered medicine. Her father had been a doctor, respected by people around him, and his work had shaped the way she saw responsibility. But the closer Joan came to choosing that path, the more she felt something inside her pulling in a different direction. She was curious about people. She liked asking questions. She noticed small details, and she had a voice that carried warmth without sounding rehearsed. That did not mean television was waiting for her. Her first real chance came in a way that would sound almost unbelievable years later. Joan went to audition at Sacramento station KCRA-TV, hoping to get her foot in the door. The audition did not go well enough to win her the job she wanted. She walked out of the building without a contract, without a clear plan, and probably with the uneasy feeling that many young people know too well. Maybe the door had closed before the dream even had time to begin. Then, in the parking lot, a weathercaster approached her. He had noticed something. Joan later recalled that he offered her an opportunity to become Sacramento's first weather girl. It was not the kind of title that suggested respect. It was not the kind of opportunity that came with dignity already attached to it, but it was television. And Joan understood that sometimes the first opening is not the one you would choose. It is simply the one you have to be brave enough to enter. She took it. At KCRA, she learned quickly that a woman in front of a camera could be watched more closely than the men standing beside her. Every small mistake seemed larger. Every imperfect word could be repeated back to her. In her recent reflections, Joan has spoken about how critics seemed to enjoy pointing out pronunciation errors while she was still learning the job. She also remembered that the station's existing staff did not exactly welcome a young woman suddenly being placed on the air, but she kept showing up. She learned the rhythm of a newsroom before sunrise, the phones ringing, the papers being marked up, the rush to get a story ready before the clock reached the top of the hour. She learned that television did not forgive hesitation and that live broadcasting had a cruel way of exposing nerves. Still, she became more than the young woman delivering a weather forecast. She began reporting. She helped produce. Within a short time, she was co-anchoring the station's noon news. That rise should have felt like proof that she belonged. Instead, it made some people more determined to remind her that they did not think she had earned it. Joan would later say that she understood why some colleagues were unhappy. She had arrived young, inexperienced, and suddenly visible. But there was another layer beneath the resentment. In the early 1970s, women in news were often expected to look pleasant, speak softly, and be grateful for whatever space they were given. They were not always expected to be ambitious. They were certainly not always expected to take a seat beside men who had spent years protecting their territory. Joan did not have the language then that she would have decades later. She was simply trying to survive a job that was already asking her to prove herself every day. By 1975, the opportunity came to leave Sacramento for New York City and WABC-TV. It was the kind of move that could change a career forever. New York was larger, faster, harsher, and impossible to impress for long. For a young woman from California, it was not merely a new job. It was a test. She joined Eyewitness News with the hope that she had finally stepped into the major leagues of broadcasting. But the new city did not make things easier. In her memoir, Joan describes an incident involving a colleague she calls Ted. According to her account, what was presented as a friendly group outing turned out to be an attempt to pressure her into an intimate situation she did not want. When she refused, she says the consequences followed her back to work. Stories she had worked on were kept off the air, harming not only her reputation, but also the income she needed to build a life in New York. For a young woman trying to establish herself, that kind of retaliation could have ended everything. Joan did not quietly accept it. She confronted the situation and made clear that she understood what was happening. The exact details belong to her own account, and that matters. But the larger truth is difficult to miss. Before Joan Lunden became a symbol of calm professionalism, she had already learned that talent alone would not protect her in television. She would have to fight for every inch, and New York had one more lesson waiting. The next year, Joan was offered a chance to fill in as co-anchor on WABC's 6 o'clock news. It should have been a triumph. Instead, according to her memoir, veteran anchor Roger Grimsby reacted with anger, telling her she had not earned the right to sit beside him. During the broadcast, she says some of the men around her mockingly called her Barbara, a reference to Barbara Walters, and the idea of a woman daring to occupy a chair that had long belonged to men. Joan sat there anyway. She did not have 17 years at Good Morning America behind her. She did not have millions of viewers waiting for her smile. She had only her nerves, her preparation, and a decision not to run from a room that clearly wanted to make her feel small. The woman America would one day trust in its mornings was still being tested in the evening news, and before she could become a household name, she would have to prove that she was more than the weather girl they had expected to disappear. At the end of the 1970s, Joan Lunden had already learned something that would stay with her for the rest of her career. Television could be generous one day and unforgiving the next. A good broadcast did not guarantee another opportunity. Respect was earned slowly, especially for a young woman trying to build a career in an industry where many people still believed the most important thing about a female broadcaster was how she looked on camera. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Joan was at WABC in New York, preparing for another ordinary workday, when her agent called with extraordinary news. ABC wanted her to become the new co-host of Good Morning America. Before she had even finished processing what that meant, the telephone rang again. This time, it was her gynecologist. She was pregnant. Years later, Joan laughed about the timing because she never saw it as bad news. She simply remembers thinking that she would have to figure out how to make both dreams work at the same time. Looking back, that moment captured something essential about her character. She rarely waited for life to become convenient before moving forward. When Joan officially joined Good Morning America in 1980 alongside David Hartman, the program was still finding its identity. Morning television had not yet become the powerful cultural force it would later become. Viewers were not simply looking for headlines. They wanted someone who could help them begin the day. Joan understood that instinct almost immediately. She did not try to sound like an evening news anchor. She smiled naturally. She listened carefully. She spoke to viewers instead of speaking at them. Whether she was interviewing a president, introducing a medical story, or talking with a family facing unimaginable hardship, she never appeared rushed, even though every morning operated on impossible deadline. America noticed. The audience did not simply watch Joan. They invited her into their homes. Families drank coffee while she spoke. Parents packed lunches while the television stayed tuned to ABC. Children heading off to school recognized her face almost as well as they recognized their teachers. Without trying to become a celebrity, Joan became one of the most familiar women in the country. Yet her greatest challenge during those early years had nothing to do with rating. It was motherhood. Today, it might seem ordinary to see a television journalist openly balancing work and family. In 1980, it was anything but ordinary. Joan discovered she was expecting her first daughter just after accepting the biggest job of her career. Instead of hiding the pregnancy, she chose to live through it publicly. That decision quietly changed television. She negotiated something almost unheard of She asked ABC if her baby could come to work. She wanted to breastfeed, remain close to her daughter, and continue hosting the nation's most visible morning program. To many executives, the request sounded impossible. To Joan, it sounded necessary. ABC agreed. For months, her infant daughter Jamie came to work with her. Between commercial breaks and production meetings, Joan was not simply preparing interviews. She was feeding her baby, changing schedules, and learning how to be both a national broadcaster and a first-time mother at exactly the same moment. She later joked that there were days when live television became even more unpredictable because motherhood refused to follow a production. The audience never saw most of it. They saw a polished broadcast. They did not see the exhausted mornings that began long before sunrise. They did not see the makeup chair while producers discussed breaking news. They did not see a young mother wondering whether she could possibly give enough of herself to both her family and the millions of viewers expecting the same reassuring smile every weekday morning. Instead of separating those two worlds, Joan gradually allowed them to exist together. She spoke openly about parenting at a time when many professional women feared doing so would make them appear less committed to their careers. She introduced conversations about family life that resonated with millions of mothers who were trying to balance work, children, and impossible expectations. According to Joan, women regularly approached her in grocery stores, restaurants, and airports to thank her, not because she had interviewed a famous politician, but because they finally saw someone on national television living a life that resembled theirs. As the years passed, Good Morning America continued to grow. When David Hartman retired in 1987, Charles Gibson joined Joan behind the anchor desk. Their chemistry felt effortless. Gibson would later become, in Joan's own words, like a brother, and together they transformed the program into the most successful morning show in America for much of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Viewers trusted them because they seemed genuine, comfortable, and deeply respectful of one another. From the outside, Joan Lunden appeared to have everything: a thriving career, a growing family, the admiration of millions. But television has always had a difficult relationship with time. And while viewers continued welcoming Joan into their homes every morning, executives inside the industry had already begun asking a question that would eventually change her life. Not whether she was still doing the job well, but whether America still wanted to see a woman growing older on television. When people remember Joan Lunden's years on Good Morning America, they often picture stability, the familiar music, the bright studio, David Hartman during the early years, Charlie Gibson later becoming her trusted partner behind the desk, the easy conversation, the warmth that made millions of Americans feel as if someone they knew had just stepped into the room. From the outside, nothing seemed to be changing. Inside television, everything was. Success has an unusual way of hiding the pressure that comes with it. As Good Morning America became one of the country's most successful morning programs, Joan's schedule grew even more demanding. The alarm rang while most of New York was still asleep. Makeup began before sunrise. Editorial meetings moved quickly. Breaking news could rewrite an entire broadcast minutes before airtime. When the cameras turned off, another day of interviews, meetings, travel, and public appearances often continued long after viewers assumed she had gone home. She loved the work. She also understood that television had quietly become her identity. For nearly 2 decades, Americans had watched Joan raise her family while building one of the most trusted careers in broadcast. She had become proof that a woman could be a respected journalist without pretending she had no children waiting at home. Her daughters later remembered kissing the television screen each morning before school because that was how they said goodbye to their mother. It was a small family ritual that viewers never knew existed, but it perfectly captured the unusual life they were living. Then, almost without warning, Joan began noticing something she had never worried about before: her age. The audience had not stopped trusting her. The ratings remained strong. The interviews continued. But inside the industry, conversations were beginning to change. Years later, Joan would admit that she did not fully recognize what was happening while she was living through it. Looking back, she realized television had always treated aging differently depending on who was sitting behind the desk. Male anchors often grew older in front of the audience and were described as experienced, distinguished, or reassuring. Women were judged by a different standard. The older they became, the more executives wondered whether someone younger should take their place. Joan has said that by the mid-1990s, she could feel those conversations happening around her, even when nobody spoke them directly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no single meeting where someone announced that her time was over. Instead, there was a growing awareness that the industry she had helped shape was beginning to imagine its future without her. In 1997, after 17 years as co-host of Good Morning America, Joan left the program. Publicly, the explanation sounded simple. She wanted more time with her family. That reason was true, but it was not the whole truth. Only many years later, particularly while writing Joan, Life Beyond the Script, did she openly discuss another part of the story. She has said she believed the network wanted someone younger, and that, at the time, she chose not to fight publicly because she wanted to leave with dignity rather than bitterness. It was a painful realization, not because she had forgotten how television worked, because she had given so much of herself to building that program. For 17 years, she had awakened before dawn, missed holidays, missed ordinary mornings, balanced deadlines with motherhood, represented the network through triumphs, tragedy, elections, natural disasters, medical breakthroughs, and moments that became part of American history. Then one day, she walked out of the studio without knowing she would never again return as its everyday host. She later admitted that leaving Good Morning America felt like losing a part of herself. Her professional identity had become so closely connected to that chair behind the desk that she had to ask a difficult question. Who was Joan Lunden if she was no longer the woman America woke up with every morning? The answer did not arrive immediately. For the first time since the beginning of her national career, there were no pre-dawn alarms set by a television schedule, no producer counting backward in her earpiece, no red light on the camera signaling that millions of people were waiting. Silence replaced routine. For many public figures, that silence becomes frightening. Joan chose to fill it differently. Instead of disappearing, she began writing more, speaking more, and gradually building a second chapter centered on health, family, and the realities of growing older. She did not know it yet, but life was about to test everything she believed about resilience once again, because the greatest challenge she would ever face would not arrive from a television executive. It would arrive from a doctor's office, carrying words that would instantly bring back memories of the father she had lost decades earlier. When Joan Lunden first heard the words triple-negative breast cancer in June 2014, she did what millions of people do after hearing a diagnosis that changes everything. She stopped hearing the conversation. Doctors continued explaining treatment. Statistics were mentioned, plans were discussed, but Joan would later admit that her mind had already drifted somewhere else, not to television, to her father. As a little girl, she had watched Dr. Lunden dedicate his life to helping cancer patients. Decades after losing him in that plane crash, she suddenly found herself walking into the same world he had spent his career trying to change. The connection felt impossible to ignore. She had spent years interviewing physicians. Now she was listening as one. For a brief moment, Joan considered disappearing from public view. She imagined putting on a baseball cap, wearing dark glasses, quietly receiving chemotherapy, and telling only the people closest. It seemed easier than allowing millions of strangers to witness the hardest year of her life. Then, another thought replaced the first. If she hid, what message would that send to every woman who had trusted her for decades? Robin Roberts, who had faced her own public health battle, encouraged Joan to get ahead of the story. Joan returned to the Good Morning America studio more than 15 years after leaving the anchor desk to tell viewers herself that she had breast cancer. It was one of the most emotional appearances of her career, not because she was reading the news, but because she had become the story. Chemotherapy changed her appearance. Her hair disappeared. Her body became exhausted. Some days were defined simply by getting through the next treatment. When People magazine proposed photographing her during chemotherapy, Joan hesitated. She worried people might think she was exploiting her illness. During the photo session, the photographers captured several versions, one wearing a wig, another with a scarf, and finally one with nothing covering her head. After everyone stepped back, Joan made a decision. The bold photograph would be the cover. Years later, she explained why. She wanted women looking at that picture to see determination instead of fear. She wanted them to believe they could survive too. One fellow patient later told Joan that it was not the missing hair she remembered. It was the confidence in her eyes that convinced her she could keep fighting. Joan would say that conversation alone made every vulnerable moment worthwhile. The diagnosis changed more than her health. It changed the direction of her life. Instead of returning only to broadcasting, Joan became one of America's strongest voices for women's health. She spoke before lawmakers, advocated for better breast density notification after mammograms, partnered with cancer organizations, and encouraged women to ask more questions about their own care. She often said that receiving cancer had unexpectedly given her another purpose, not because the disease was a gift, but because surviving it gave her a chance to help someone else. Looking back now at 75, Joan rarely measures her life only by television rating or awards. She sees the 7 children she helped raise, the grandchildren who know her simply as grandma, the women who wrote letters saying they scheduled mammograms because of something she shared, the caregivers who found comfort in her books, the audiences who still remember waking up with her voice before heading to work or school. Her memoir, Joan, Life Beyond the Script, finally allowed her to tell the entire story, not only the years behind the anchor desk, but everything that came afterward. She has said she could not have written this book earlier because only now could she see the complete arc of her life. She no longer believes she needed to top Good Morning America. The decades after leaving television became meaningful in completely different ways. Perhaps that is the real tragedy behind Joan Lunden's story. Not the cancer, not leaving television, not even the barriers she faced as a young journalist. The true tragedy is that for so many years, America believed it already knew her. Viewers saw the smile, they saw confidence, they saw perfect mornings. What they could not see was the young girl who lost her father too soon, the ambitious reporter fighting to be taken seriously, the working mother trying to balance 7 children with one of the most demanding jobs in television, the woman quietly navigating rejection in an industry that feared aging, and the survivor who transformed one frightening diagnosis into a lifetime of advocacy. At 75, Joan Lunden is no longer defined by the chair she once occupied on morning television. She is defined by everything she did after standing up from it. If Joan Lunden was part of your morning, share your favorite memory in the comments below. And if her story reminded you why courage often looks much quieter than we imagine, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Her broadcasts ended years ago, but for millions of Americans, the trust she earned has never really gone away.